A kind-hearted waitress decided to feed a hungry homeless boy who wandered into her diner. But when she discovered his true identity, her world was turned upside down. This touching story of kindness, surprises, and life-changing revelations will leave you in awe. The rain poured relentlessly, hammering against the glass windows of the small-town diner. Inside, the warm golden light of the hanging lamps cast a cozy glow over the sparse seating area. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon lingered in the air, offering a comforting contrast to the storm raging outside. Emma, a diligent and kind-hearted waitress, wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Thursdays were usually slow, but the downpour had turned the night even quieter. Emma glanced at the clock hanging above the cash register. Almost 9 p.m. She sighed, thinking about the long shift that had stretched before her. She was about to head back to the kitchen when the faint sound of the diner's bell jingled. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of icy wind and a figure cloaked in shadows. A boy, no older than 12, stepped hesitantly into the diner. His sneakers squished audibly against the tiled floor, water dripping from the hem of his oversized jacket. His face was pale, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that carried an expression Emma couldn't quite place. Fear mixed with exhaustion. He clutched a tattered backpack to his chest, his fingers gripping the straps so tightly they turned white. Emma instinctively put down the rag she was holding. "Hey there," she greeted softly, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding on the roof. She walked toward him, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening. "You okay?" The boy didn't respond at first. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the empty booths and chairs as if searching for an escape route. Finally, he nodded, though his hesitation was palpable. "Come on in," Emma said, gesturing toward a booth near the corner. "You'll catch your death out there." The boy hesitated for a moment, then shuffled over to the booth, his shoes leaving wet prints on the clean floor. He sat on the edge of the seat, his posture stiff, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Emma approached him with a warm smile. "What can I get you? Something to eat? Maybe a hot chocolate to warm you up?" The boy looked up at her, his wide, doe-like eyes filled with suspicion. His stomach growled loudly, betraying his hunger. "I don't have any money," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma waved off his concern. "Don't worry about that," she said gently. "Just sit tight. I'll be right back." In the kitchen, Emma quickly prepared a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and bacon. She poured a steaming mug of hot chocolate, adding a generous dollop of whipped cream on top. As she worked, she couldn't stop thinking about the boy. What was he doing out in this storm? Where were his parents? Her heart ached at the thought of a child being so alone. She returned to the booth, setting the plate and mug down in front of him. "Here you go," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Eat up." The boy hesitated for a moment, then picked up a fork and began to eat. His movements were quick, almost desperate, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Emma watched him, her chest tightening with a mix of sorrow and curiosity. "What's your name?" she asked after a while. The boy paused, his fork hovering over the plate. "Jake," he said softly, not meeting her gaze. "Nice to meet you, Jake. I'm Emma," she replied, offering a reassuring smile. "What brings you out in this weather?" Jake's grip on his fork tightened, and he seemed to shrink into himself. "Just needed somewhere to stay dry," he mumbled. Emma nodded, not wanting to push him. She could tell that whatever had brought him here wasn't something he was ready to share. Instead, she focused on making him feel safe. "Well, Jake, you're welcome to stay here as long as you need," she said. "It's warm, and we've got plenty of food." Jake's eyes flicked up to meet hers, a flicker of gratitude shining through his guarded expression. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. As the rain continued to hammer against the diner's windows, Emma found herself glancing at Jake more and more. There was something about him, something in the way he carried himself, in the haunted look in his eyes, that tugged at her heart. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew one thing for certain. This boy was carrying a burden far too heavy for his small shoulders. The night wore on, and the diner grew even quieter. The last of the patrons left, leaving Emma and Jake alone. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee for herself and brought another plate of food for Jake, who had finished his first meal. He accepted it with a shy nod, his guarded demeanor beginning to soften. "So, Jake," Emma said, breaking the silence, "do you live around here?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the window as if considering his answer. Not really, he said finally. Emma frowned but kept her tone light. Where are your parents? Jake's shoulders stiffened and he looked down at his plate. I don't have any, he said quietly. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Emma's heart broke for him, but she knew better than to press further. Instead, she reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on his small, trembling one. Well, Jake, she said softly, you've got me for now. Jake looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For the first time that night, his lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the diner felt like a small sanctuary in the chaos of the night. Emma watched as Jake relaxed ever so slightly, the warmth of the food and the safety of the space easing the tension in his small frame. She cleared her throat, breaking the silence gently. So, Jake, do you go to school? She asked, hoping to keep the conversation light enough for him to open up. Jake glanced at her, then shook his head. Not anymore, he said simply, his voice carrying a mix of defiance and sorrow. Emma's chest tightened at his response. That's a shame, she said softly, trying to tread carefully. School's not always fun, but it's important. Jake didn't reply. Instead, he stared out the window, his fingers playing with the edge of his now empty plate. Emma took a moment to study him. His clothes, though too big for his frame, were in surprisingly decent condition. His jacket had patches on the elbows and his sneakers were worn, but not falling apart. It was clear someone had cared for him once, but for how long, and why had they stopped? Emma decided to switch tactics. You've got quite the appetite, she said with a small laugh, gesturing toward the empty plate. Want some dessert? I make a mean slice of apple pie. Jake's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. I guess, he murmured. Emma took his empty plate and disappeared into the kitchen. As she cut a generous slice of pie and placed it on a plate, her mind raced. Jake's guarded demeanor made her certain he'd been through something traumatic. She wished she could do more than offer him food and a warm place to stay, but for now, that would have to be enough. Returning to the table, she set the pie and a glass of milk in front of him. There you go, freshly made this morning. Jake dug into the pie without hesitation, and Emma smiled, feeling a small sense of victory. She decided to try again. Jake, you don't have to tell me anything you don't want to, she said gently. But if there's someone you trust who could come get you, I'd be happy to call them. Jake paused mid-bite, his fork hovering in the air. He looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes, as though she'd just asked him the most difficult question in the world. There's no one, he said after a long silence. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but the weight of those words hit Emma like a freight train. No one at all? She asked softly. Jake shook his head. Not anymore. Emma's heart ached for him. She leaned back in her seat, unsure of what to say. For all the kindness she could offer, she knew it wouldn't fix whatever had led Jake to this point, but she also knew she couldn't just let him walk back into the storm when he had nowhere to go. Well, she said finally, her voice steady, you're welcome to stay here for as long as you need. Jake looked up at her, his eyes shining with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. Why are you being so nice to me? He asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Emma smiled gently. Because everyone deserves a little kindness, Jake, especially when they're going through a tough time. Jake stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Thanks, he said, his voice barely audible. As the hours passed, the rain outside began to lighten, but Emma knew it wasn't safe to send Jake back out into the night. The diner had a small storeroom in the back with a cot where she sometimes rested between shifts. She led Jake there, grabbing an extra blanket and pillow from the closet. You can sleep here, she said, fluffing the pillow and setting it on the cot. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. Jake stood in the doorway, his backpack still clutched tightly to his chest. He looked at the cot, then back at Emma. Why are you doing all this? He asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and confusion. Emma knelt down in front of him, her eyes level with his. Because I've been where you are, Jake, she said softly. Not exactly, but close enough to know how hard it is to trust someone when you feel like the world's turned its back on you. Jake's brow furrowed, and he hesitated before stepping into the room. He placed his backpack on the floor and sat on the edge of the cot, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally caught up with him. Emma stood in the doorway, giving him space. Get some rest, she said gently. I'll be right outside if you need anything. Jake nodded, his small frame looking even smaller on the cot. As Emma closed the door behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jake's story than he was letting on. She resolved to help him, no matter what it took. The diner was eerily quiet that night, save for the soft patter of rain outside and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Emma sat at the counter, her mind swirling with thoughts about Jake. Who was he running from? Why did he have no one to turn to? And most importantly, how could she help him? As the hours ticked by, Emma's exhaustion began to creep in. She rested her head on her folded arms, but the faint rustling sound from the storeroom jolted her awake. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. Rising from her seat, she tiptoed toward the storeroom door, listening intently. "Jake?" she called softly, tapping on the door. There was no immediate response, but then she heard a quiet, shaky voice. "I'm fine." Emma opened the door a crack and saw Jake sitting upright on the cot, his knees pulled to his chest and his arms wrapped tightly around them. His face was pale, his eyes distant. "Nightmare?" she asked gently, stepping into the room. Jake hesitated, then nodded. He didn't meet her gaze, instead staring at a spot on the floor as if it held all the answers to his unspoken questions. Emma sat on the edge of a nearby chair, giving him space. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said, "but sometimes it helps." Jake bit his lip, his small frame trembling slightly. "I dreamt about my mom," he whispered. "She used to make pancakes for me every Saturday morning. They were my favorite." Emma's heart sank. "She sounds like she cared about you a lot," she said softly. "She did," Jake replied, his voice cracking. "But she got sick. We didn't have money for her treatment. I tried to take care of her, but..." His words caught in his throat, and he buried his face in his hands. Emma felt a pang of sorrow so deep it almost took her breath away. "Jake, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You did everything you could." Jake shook his head, his voice muffled by his hands. "It wasn't enough. After she died, everything fell apart. The landlord kicked me out. I didn't have anywhere to go." Emma moved closer, keeping her voice calm and soothing. "You've been through so much, Jake. No one should have to go through that alone." Jake finally looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." Emma hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Because I see a lot of myself in you," she admitted. "When I was younger, I lost my parents too. It was hard. I know how it feels to feel like you're all alone in the world." Jake's gaze softened, and for the first time since they'd met, Emma saw a glimmer of trust in his eyes. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. "I leaned on the people who showed me kindness," Emma said. "It wasn't easy, but they helped me see that there's always a way forward, even when it feels impossible." Jake nodded slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. "I don't know how to move forward," he confessed. "It feels like everything's too broken." Emma reached out and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "One step at a time, Jake, and you don't have to do it alone." For the rest of the night, Emma stayed with Jake, talking to him about her own struggles and the small victories that had eventually brought her to where she was now. She didn't have all the answers, but she hoped her honesty would show Jake that he wasn't alone in his pain. As dawn approached, Jake finally drifted off to sleep, his small body curled up on the cot. Emma watched him for a moment, a mix of sadness and determination welling up in her chest. She didn't know how, but she was going to help him find his way. The first rays of sunlight pierced through the diner's blinds, casting a golden hue over the once shadowed interior. Emma, still sitting near Jake's makeshift cot, rubbed her tired eyes and stretched her stiff limbs. Despite her exhaustion, a sense of purpose grounded her. Jake stirred, blinking groggily at the unfamiliar room. For a brief moment, confusion flashed across his face before the events of the previous day came rushing back. His eyes found Emma, and his expression softened. "Morning," Emma said, her voice kind but laced with fatigue. "How are you feeling?" Jake sat up slowly, his thin arms wrapping around his knees. "Better, I think," he murmured. "Thanks for everything." "You don't have to thank me," Emma replied. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes." As Jake stretched and began to get up, Emma's mind churned with questions. How could she help him beyond this one night? What resources were available for a boy like Jake? The city was harsh, but she knew there had to be a way to find him safety and stability. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her boss, Mr. Carter, who strode into the diner with his usual air of authority. He paused in his tracks when he saw Jake, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Emma," he said, his tone sharp. "What's going on here?" Emma took a deep breath, standing between Mr. Carter and Jake. "This is Jake," she said. "He needed a place to stay last night. I couldn't just leave him out in the rain." Mr. Carter frowned deeply, his gaze flicking between Emma and Jake. "This isn't a shelter," he said firmly, "and we can't have strangers staying here." "I understand, Mr. Carter," Emma said, her voice steady but resolute. "But Jake didn't have anywhere else to go. I couldn't just ignore him." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes downcast. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. "I'll leave. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." Before Mr. Carter could respond, Emma held up a hand. "Wait," she said, turning to Jake. "You're not going anywhere until we figure out a plan. You're not a problem, Jake. You're a kid who needs help." Mr. Carter crossed his arms, his stern expression softening just a fraction. "Emma, I admire your compassion, but we have to be practical. Do you have any idea how to help him long-term?" Emma hesitated, her mind racing. "I'll figure it out," she said finally. "I just need some time." Mr. Carter sighed, shaking his head. "Fine," he said, "but this is on you. You can't keep him here indefinitely." "Understood," Emma said, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." As Mr. Carter walked away, Emma turned back to Jake, who was staring at her with wide eyes. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you care so much?" Emma crouched down so they were at eye level. "Because you matter, Jake," she said firmly, "and because I know what it's like to feel like the world's given up on you. But I'm not giving up." Jake's lower lip trembled, and he nodded, unable to speak. With the immediate crisis averted, Emma knew her next step was to find resources for Jake. She didn't know much about the city's social services, but she was determined to learn. After her shift ended, she spent hours researching shelters, youth programs, and nonprofit organizations that could provide support. As the day stretched into evening, Emma finally found a glimmer of hope, a local nonprofit called Haven's Hope, which specialized in helping homeless youth. She made a call, explaining Jake's situation, and was relieved to hear genuine concern on the other end of the line. "We can definitely help," said the woman on the phone, whose name was Rachel. "If you can bring him to our center tomorrow, we'll start the intake process and make sure he gets the care he needs." Emma felt a surge of relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Thank you so much." That evening, as she shared the news with Jake, she saw the first spark of hope light up in his eyes. "You really think they can help me?" he asked. "I do," Emma said, her smile warm and reassuring. "This is the first step, Jake. You're not alone anymore." The next morning, Emma and Jake arrived at Haven's Hope, a modest but welcoming building nestled in the heart of the city. The center's sign, adorned with vibrant colors, read, "Haven's Hope, a safe place for youth." The sight of it filled Emma with cautious optimism, and she glanced at Jake, who clutched his frayed backpack nervously. "It's going to be okay," Emma said, her voice steady. "This is a place where they help kids like you." Jake nodded hesitantly, his fingers tightening around the straps of his bag. "What if they don't want me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Emma knelt down so they were eye level. "They will," she said firmly. "You deserve help, Jake, and they're going to see that." Together they stepped inside, greeted by a cozy interior and the warm scent of freshly brewed coffee. The walls were decorated with colorful murals of nature scenes, and a bulletin board near the entrance displayed uplifting messages and resources. A woman with kind eyes and a clipboard approached them, her smile immediately putting them at ease. "You must be Emma and Jake," she said. "I'm Rachel. Welcome to Haven's Hope." Jake mumbled a quiet hi, while Emma extended her hand. "Thank you for meeting with us," Emma said. "Jake's been through a lot, and he needs a safe place." Rachel nodded, her expression compassionate. "You're in the right place," she said. "Jake, let's get you settled. I'll show you around and explain how we can help." Jake glanced at Emma, seeking reassurance. She nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead," she said. "I'll be right here." As Rachel led Jake deeper into the center, Emma took a seat in the waiting area, her thoughts racing. She felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Bringing Jake here felt like the right decision, but she couldn't shake the worry that it might not work out. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel returned, her expression bright. "Jake's getting settled," she said. We've got a room for him, and he'll meet with our caseworker this afternoon. He's a sweet kid, Emma. You've done an amazing thing by bringing him here." Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said. "I just want him to be safe." Rachel sat down beside her. "Haven's Hope is more than a shelter," she explained. "We offer counseling, education programs, and job training. Our goal is to help kids like Jake find stability and build a future." Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "That's exactly what he needs," she said. Rachel smiled warmly. "We'll keep you updated on his progress," she said, "and if you ever want to visit, you're welcome here anytime." Emma nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in days, she felt like Jake's future was no longer uncertain. Later that evening, back at the diner, Emma couldn't help but replay the events of the day in her mind. She worked her shift with a lighter heart, her movements filled with purpose. Her co-workers noticed the change, though some were still skeptical of her decision to help Jake. "You really think he's going to be okay there?" asked Karen, one of the waitresses, as they restocked the sugar containers. "I do," Emma said, her voice unwavering. "Haven's Hope is exactly what he needs, and if he needs more, I'll be there to help." Karen shook her head, a mix of disbelief and admiration on her face. "You've got a good heart, Emma. I just hope it doesn't get broken." Emma smiled faintly. "Caring for people is always a risk," she said, "but it's worth it." Meanwhile, at Haven's Hope, Jake sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the small window of his new room. The space was simple but clean, with a twin bed, a desk, and a dresser. For the first time in months, he had a roof over his head and a sense of security. Rachel had visited him earlier to explain the next steps, a meeting with his caseworker to discuss his background and goals, followed by an introduction to the center's programs. It was overwhelming, but for the first time, Jake felt like he wasn't alone. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, worn notebook. Flipping through the pages, he found a sketch he'd drawn months ago, a scene of a family sitting by a campfire, their faces lit with warmth and happiness. The memory of drawing it brought a lump to his throat. He hadn't felt that kind of safety in a long time. But now there was a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this could be a new beginning. As the days passed at Haven's Hope, Jake slowly began to adapt to his new environment. The initial nervousness that had clouded his first few days started to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of belonging. The staff, particularly Rachel, were kind and patient, giving him the space he needed to open up on his own terms. Jake's first meeting with his caseworker, Mr. Collins, was an important step. Mr. Collins was a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and a knack for making people feel comfortable. Sitting across from Jake in a small office filled with books and plants, he began their session with a simple question. "Tell me about yourself, Jake. What do you love to do?" Jake hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. He wasn't used to being asked such open-ended questions, and the idea of sharing his interests felt strangely vulnerable. After a long pause, he mumbled, "I like drawing." Mr. Collins smiled warmly. "That's great. What kind of things do you draw?" Jake shrugged, his voice barely audible. "Anything, I guess. People, places, stuff I see." "Do you have your sketches with you?" Mr. Collins asked. Jake nodded, pulling his worn notebook from his backpack. He handed it over hesitantly, watching as Mr. Collins flipped through the pages. The caseworker's face lit up as he studied the detailed drawings. "These are incredible, Jake," he said sincerely. "You've got real talent." Jake's cheeks flushed, but he couldn't help the small smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. It had been a long time since anyone had complimented his work. Back at the diner, Emma eagerly awaited updates from Haven's Hope. She often found herself checking her phone during breaks, hoping for a message about Jake's progress. When Rachel finally called one afternoon, Emma answered immediately, her heart racing. "Hi, Emma," Rachel said warmly. "I just wanted to let you know that Jake is doing well. He's starting to participate in activities, and he's opening up to his caseworker." Emma's shoulders relaxed, relief washing over her. "That's amazing to hear," she said. "Thank you for keeping me updated." "There's more," Rachel added. "Jake mentioned that he loves drawing. We have an art program here, and he's been invited to join. It seems like a great fit for him." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's perfect for him," she said. "He's such a talented artist." Over the next few weeks, Jake threw himself into the art program. The sessions were held in a bright, airy room filled with easels, paint, and every art supply imaginable. For Jake, it felt like stepping into another world. a place where he could express himself freely, without fear of judgment. Under the guidance of Ms. Parker, the program's instructor, Jake began experimenting with new mediums. He sketched with charcoal, painted with vibrant acrylics, and even tried his hand at sculpting. Each session brought him a little closer to finding his voice as an artist. "You've got a gift, Jake," Ms. Parker said one afternoon as she admired his latest painting, a serene landscape of rolling hills under a fiery sunset. "Have you ever thought about pursuing art as a career?" Jake shrugged, unsure how to respond. The idea of a future, let alone one where he could thrive as an artist, was still foreign to him, but the question lingered in his mind long after the session ended. Meanwhile, Emma couldn't stop thinking about Jake. Though she trusted Haven's hope to take care of him, she missed seeing his face and hearing his voice. Finally, she decided to visit him at the center. When Emma arrived, Rachel greeted her warmly and led her to the art room. As they approached, Emma peeked through the door and saw Jake hunched over a canvas, his brow furrowed in concentration. She knocked lightly and his head shot up. "Emma!" Jake exclaimed, his face breaking into a wide grin. Emma stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the vibrant painting he was working on. "Wow, Jake," she said, her voice filled with awe. "This is incredible." Jake blushed, his smile sheepish. "It's nothing special," he mumbled. "Don't say that," Emma said firmly. "You have a gift, Jake. I'm so proud of you." They spent the next hour catching up, Jake excitedly showing Emma his sketches and paintings. For the first time, he spoke with enthusiasm about his future, sharing his newfound dream of becoming an artist. "Ms. Parker says I could go to art school one day," Jake said, his eyes shining with hope. "Do you think I could do it, Emma?" Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know you can," she said, "and I'll be here to help you every step of the way." As Emma left Haven's Hope that evening, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. Jake was thriving, and she could see a bright future ahead for him. She had no doubt that he would achieve his dreams, and she was determined to support him however she could. But as much as Emma's focus was on Jake's progress, she couldn't ignore the changes happening within herself. Helping Jake had awakened something in her, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She realized that she wanted to do more, not just for Jake, but for others in need. The journey was far from over, but Emma and Jake were both on the path to something greater, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt full of possibility. Jake's life at Haven's Hope continued to evolve in ways he never imagined. The boy who had once spent his days wandering the streets now had a routine filled with purpose. Between his art classes, counseling sessions, and growing friendships with other residents, Jake was starting to feel like he belonged somewhere. One particularly significant moment came during a community art showcase hosted by Haven's Hope. Ms. Parker encouraged all her students to submit pieces for the event, and though Jake was hesitant at first, he eventually agreed to display a painting he had poured his heart into. The day of the showcase arrived, and the atmosphere at Haven's Hope buzzed with excitement. The common room had been transformed into a vibrant gallery, with artwork lining the walls and tables. Guests from the community, including donors and local art enthusiasts, milled about, admiring the pieces. Emma arrived early, eager to support Jake. As she walked through the room, her eyes were immediately drawn to his painting, a stunning depiction of a bustling city street at sunset, its rich colors and intricate details capturing both chaos and beauty. A small placard beneath the painting read, "City of Dreams by Jake, age 14. Emma's heart swelled with pride. She spotted Jake standing nervously near the refreshment table, fidgeting with his shirt. She approached him with a beaming smile. "Jake, your painting is incredible," Emma said, her voice full of admiration. "You should be so proud of yourself." Jake shrugged, his face flushing. "I don't know. What if no one likes it?" "They will," Emma said firmly. "Trust me." As the event progressed, Jake's painting attracted considerable attention. A local gallery owner named Mr. Hernandez stopped in front of it, his gaze lingering on the vibrant scene. After a moment, he turned to Ms. Parker, who stood nearby. "Who's the artist?" he asked, his tone intrigued. Ms. Parker gestured toward Jake. "That's Jake, one of our most promising students." Mr. Hernandez approached Jake, who looked up nervously as the man extended a hand. "Jake, this is extraordinary work," he said warmly. "Have you ever thought about exhibiting your art in a gallery?" Jake blinked, stunned. "A gallery? No, I've never—" "Well, you should. Mr. Hernandez interrupted, smiling. With your talent, you could go far. Jake's heart raced as the man handed him a business card. If you're interested, have Ms. Parker contact me. I'd love to feature your work in our next showcase. That evening, after the event had concluded and the guests had departed, Jake sat in the art room with Ms. Parker and Emma, holding the business card tightly in his hand. I can't believe this, Jake said, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and disbelief. Do you really think I could do it? Ms. Parker nodded, her eyes shining with pride. Absolutely, Jake. You have a gift, and people are starting to see that. Emma placed a hand on his shoulder. This is just the beginning, Jake. You've worked so hard, and you deserve this chance. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a brighter future. He didn't know exactly where this opportunity would lead, but he was ready to find out. Over the next few weeks, Jake and Ms. Parker worked together to prepare his artwork for submission to the gallery. Jake poured his energy into creating new pieces, each one reflecting a part of his journey. There was a painting of a rain-soaked street, inspired by the night Emma found him. Another depicted a sunrise over a cityscape, symbolizing hope and new beginnings. As he worked, Jake found himself reflecting on how far he had come. He thought about the nights he had spent on the streets, hungry and alone, and the overwhelming kindness Emma had shown him. It was because of her that he was here, surrounded by people who believed in him and supported his dreams. One evening, as he packed up his supplies, Jake turned to Ms. Parker. Do you think Emma knows how much she's changed my life? Ms. Parker smiled gently. I think she knows, Jake, but it never hurts to remind her. Meanwhile, Emma was experiencing her own transformation. Seeing Jake flourish had reignited her sense of purpose, and she began to consider ways she could do more to help others. She started volunteering at Haven's Hope, assisting with meals and organizing activities for the residents. Her shifts at the diner became more than just a job. They were an opportunity to connect with people and make a difference, no matter how small. One afternoon, as Emma wiped down tables after the lunch rush, her co-worker Carla approached her. You've been smiling a lot more lately, Carla said teasingly. What's going on? Emma paused, her mind flashing to Jake's painting and the joy she felt every time she saw him succeed. I guess I've just realized how much good there is in the world, she said, and how much we can do to help others if we just try. Carla raised an eyebrow. Sounds like someone's turning into a saint. Emma laughed, shaking her head. Not a saint, just someone who's trying to make a difference. The day finally came when Jake's artwork was delivered to Mr. Hernandez's gallery. Ms. Parker and Emma accompanied him, offering words of encouragement as they helped him carry the carefully wrapped pieces inside. As they left the gallery, Jake turned to Emma, his eyes filled with gratitude. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, he said quietly. Thank you, Emma, for everything. Emma smiled, her heart full. You've done this, Jake. You've worked hard, and you've earned every bit of this. I'm just lucky I got to be a part of your journey. As they walked back to Haven's Hope, Emma and Jake both felt a sense of hope for the future. They didn't know what was ahead, but they were ready to face it together. The night of the gallery showcase arrived, and the streets of the city buzzed with energy. The gallery, nestled in a vibrant part of downtown, was transformed into a haven of creativity. Soft lighting illuminated the walls where paintings of various styles and themes hung proudly. Among them were Jake's works, his vivid depictions of resilience and hope standing out like beacons. Jake stood near the entrance, nervously adjusting his tie. He wasn't used to events like this, and the sight of elegantly dressed guests mingling with glasses of champagne in hand made him feel out of place. Emma noticed his unease and approached him with a reassuring smile. You look great, Jake, she said. And your paintings. They're incredible. Everyone's going to love them. Jake took a deep breath, nodding. I hope so. It still feels like a dream. The gallery quickly filled with visitors, their conversations punctuated by laughter and exclamations of admiration for the art on display. Mr. Hernandez, the gallery owner, introduced Jake to several guests, each interaction bolstering Jake's confidence. As he spoke about his work, he began to see how deeply his paintings resonated with others. People were moved by the stories behind them, stories he had poured into each brushstroke. Emma watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. Seeing Jake stand tall, his once weary face now alight with purpose, was a reminder of how far he had come. She had always believed in him, but tonight she saw him beginning to believe in himself. As the evening progressed, a well-dressed man and woman approached Jake's display. The woman's eyes lingered on a painting of a rain-soaked street, her expression softening. She leaned closer to the man beside her, whispering something before turning to Jake. "This is stunning," she said, her voice warm. "The detail, the emotion, it's incredible. Are you the artist?" Jake nodded, his cheeks flushing. "Yes, ma'am, thank you so much." The man stepped forward, extending a hand. "You've got real talent, son. I'm Michael Davenport, and this is my wife, Lydia. We collect art, and we'd like to purchase this piece for our home." Jake's eyes widened, and he hesitated for a moment before shaking Michael's hand. "Thank you, Mr. Davenport. That means a lot to me." While Jake finalized the sale with Mr. Hernandez, Emma stood nearby, marveling at how quickly his life was changing. She turned to Miss Parker, who had been quietly observing the scene. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Emma said. "To think he was on the streets just a few months ago." Miss Parker nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "It's a testament to what happens when someone is given a chance, and Jake's story is just beginning." But as the evening unfolded, a surprising revelation was about to emerge. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, Jake noticed an older man lingering near one of his paintings. The man's suit was impeccably tailored, and his silver hair gleamed under the gallery lights. There was something familiar about him, though Jake couldn't quite place it. Emma, too, noticed the man's intense focus on the painting. She walked over to Jake, whispering, "Do you know him?" Jake shook his head. "No, but he's been standing there for a while." Summoning his courage, Jake approached the man. "Excuse me, sir," he said politely. "I noticed you were looking at my painting. Is there something I can help you with?" The man turned slowly, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Jake's. For a moment, he said nothing, as if he were searching for the right words. "You're the artist?" the man asked, his voice deep but gentle. "Yes, sir," Jake replied. The man studied Jake's face, his expression softening. "I know this might sound strange, but your name is Jake, isn't it?" Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Yes, how did you know that?" The man took a deep breath, his eyes glistening. "Because I've been searching for you. My name is Henry Cartwright. I'm your grandfather." The room seemed to tilt for a moment as Jake processed the man's words. He took a step back, his mind racing. "My grandfather?" he echoed. Henry nodded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Your mother was my daughter. I lost track of her years ago, and when I learned she'd had a son, I've been looking for you ever since." Jake's breath caught in his throat. He barely remembered his mother, and he had never known anything about his extended family. The revelation left him stunned, unsure of what to say. Emma, sensing Jake's overwhelm, stepped forward. "Mr. Cartwright, this is a lot for Jake to take in. Maybe we could all sit down and talk." Henry nodded, his gaze never leaving Jake. "Of course. I didn't mean to overwhelm you, Jake. I needed to find you." They moved to a quieter corner of the gallery, where Henry began to share his story. He explained how he had lost contact with Jake's mother after a family dispute, and had only recently discovered her passing through an old acquaintance. Learning that he had a grandson had ignited a determination in him to reconnect, but it had taken months to track Jake down. "I had no idea you were going through so much," Henry said, his voice heavy with regret. "If I'd known, I would have been there for you." Jake listened, his emotions a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and a flicker of hope. He had spent so long feeling alone, and now, here was a man claiming to be his family. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked finally, his voice tinged with suspicion. Henry's expression softened. "I don't want anything from you, Jake. I just want to be part of your life if you'll let me, and if there's anything I can do to help you, I will." Emma placed a reassuring hand on Jake's shoulder. "It's okay to take your time with this, Jake. You don't have to make any decisions right now." Jake nodded, his mind still reeling. I need to think about this." Henry reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. "Take this, Jake. My contact information is on it. Whenever you're ready, call me." Jake took the card, his hand trembling. "Okay, thank you." As Henry stood to leave, he paused, looking at Jake with a mix of hope and sorrow. "Your mother would have been so proud of you. She always believed you were destined for great things." With that, he walked out of the gallery, leaving Jake and Emma sitting in stunned silence. The days following Henry Cartwright's revelation were a blur for Jake. The gallery event had been a monumental success, with multiple paintings sold, but the encounter with his grandfather overshadowed it all. Jake sat in his small apartment, the business card Henry had given him lying on the table. He stared at it, the neatly printed name and number feeling almost surreal. Emma, ever the supportive friend, visited frequently, bringing meals and gentle encouragement. She found Jake deep in thought one afternoon, the card still untouched. "You haven't called him yet, have you?" she asked, setting down a container of pasta on the counter. Jake shook his head. "I don't know what to say. What if this is some kind of trick? What if he's just here out of guilt?" Emma pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. "Jake, I get it. You've been through so much on your own. Letting someone in, especially family, is scary." But he seemed genuine. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's just, I've spent so long thinking I didn't have anyone. Now, out of nowhere, this man shows up claiming to be my grandfather. What if he's just trying to make himself feel better for abandoning my mom?" Emma leaned forward, placing her hand over his. "You're allowed to feel conflicted, but you're also allowed to hope, Jake. Maybe he wasn't there for your mom, but he's here now. It's worth hearing him out." That evening, Jake sat in his room, the card in his hand. His heart pounded as he finally picked up his phone and dialed the number. It rang twice before Henry's voice came through, warm and filled with anticipation. "Jake, is that you?" "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's me." Henry's relief was palpable. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if I'd hear from you." Jake hesitated, then said, "I have questions. About my mom. About why you weren't there." Henry's voice grew somber. "I expected that, and I owe you answers. If you're willing, I'd like to meet again. Somewhere quiet, where we can talk." After a pause, Jake agreed. They arranged to meet at a small cafe downtown the next day. The cafe was cozy, with warm lighting and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Jake arrived early, his nerves buzzing. He chose a table near the window, giving him a view of the street outside. A few minutes later, Henry walked in, carrying the same composed yet humble demeanor he had at the gallery. "Jake," he greeted, his smile tinged with nervousness. "Thank you for coming." Jake nodded, gesturing for Henry to sit. "I'm here because I need to understand. Why weren't you there for her? For us?" Henry took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "Your mother, Clara, was my only daughter. We had a falling out when she was in her 20s. She wanted to pursue art, but I was stubborn. I didn't support her dreams, and we grew apart." His voice cracked as he continued. "When she told me about you, I wanted to reconnect, but by then, she was already gone. I searched for years, Jake, but I didn't know where to start. I failed her, and I failed you." Jake listened, his emotions swirling. He had spent years blaming himself for being alone, thinking he was unworthy of love. Hearing Henry's regret didn't erase the pain, but it planted a seed of understanding. "Why now?" Jake asked, his tone guarded. "Why are you here after all this time?" Henry met his gaze, sincerity shining through his eyes. "Because when I learned about you, I knew I couldn't let history repeat itself. I couldn't fix the past, but I could try to be there for you now, if you'll let me." Jake stared at him, the weight of his words settling in. He wasn't sure if he could trust Henry yet, but there was something in the older man's voice that struck a chord, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. They spent hours talking, Henry sharing stories about Clara, her passion for art, and the stubborn determination that Jake seemed to have inherited. Jake, in turn, shared his journey, his struggles on the streets, the moments he felt invisible, and how Emma's kindness had been the turning point. As they left the cafe, Henry stopped Jake at the door. "I know trust takes time, Jake. I won't push, but I want you to know I'm here. You're not alone anymore." Jake nodded, his heart heavy yet lightened by the conversation. "Thanks. I'll think about it." Walking home, Jake felt a mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and a faint glimmer of hope. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have a family, to feel rooted in something beyond his struggles. Over the next few weeks, Henry made small but consistent efforts to show his sincerity. He attended Jake's art classes, offered advice on navigating the business side of the art world, and even bought supplies to support Jake's work. Emma noticed the change in Jake, his guarded demeanor softening as he began to open up. "You seem lighter," she remarked one evening as they worked on a painting together. Jake smiled faintly. "I guess I'm starting to believe that maybe he's not just here out of guilt. Maybe he really does want to be part of my life." Emma squeezed his shoulder. "You deserve to have people in your corner, Jake. Don't forget that." As Jake's trust in Henry grew, so did his confidence in himself. He poured his emotions into his art, creating pieces that captured the complexity of healing and connection. One painting in particular, a vibrant depiction of a tree with roots intertwining around broken stones, became a symbol of his journey. At another gallery event, Henry stood by Jake's side, introducing him proudly to guests. Emma watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. Jake was no longer the homeless boy she had found outside the diner. He was an artist, a fighter, and someone who had found the strength to reclaim his story. But the journey wasn't over yet. There were still layers of pain to uncover, and lessons to learn about forgiveness, love, and the bonds that make us whole. In the months that followed, Jake's life underwent a transformation that seemed almost unreal to him. What once felt like an endless battle for survival had become a journey of self-discovery, connection, and purpose. His growing relationship with Henry played a pivotal role in this shift, but it wasn't without its challenges. Jake still had moments of doubt, flashes of anger at the years lost to isolation and hardship. Some days he struggled to reconcile the grandfather he was coming to know with the absence he had endured. But each time those feelings arose, Henry met them with patience, humility, and an unwavering commitment to earn Jake's trust. One evening, Henry invited Jake and Emma to dinner at his townhouse, a modest yet elegant home filled with memories of the past. The dining room was adorned with old photographs, many of which featured Clara as a young girl. Jake lingered by the mantel, his fingers grazing the edges of a framed picture of his mother smiling brightly. "She had your eyes," Henry said softly, coming to stand beside him. "That same spark, that same fire." Jake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could have known her better. I only have bits and pieces, things she told me when I was little before everything fell apart." Henry placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "She would be proud of you, Jake. I know she would." Over dinner, Emma shared stories about Jake's early days at the diner, painting a vivid picture of his resilience and determination. Henry listened intently, his admiration for his grandson evident in the way he hung on every word. "You've been through so much," Henry said, his tone reflective, "but you've never let it break you. That strength, it's extraordinary." Jake shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't feel strong most of the time. I just did what I had to do to survive." Henry shook his head. "Surviving takes strength, Jake. And thriving after everything you've been through, that takes courage." As the evening wound down, Henry brought out a small, wrapped package. "I've been holding on to this for years," he said, handing it to Jake. "I think it's time you had it." Jake unwrapped the package carefully, revealing an old sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings, some rough, some intricate, all imbued with a sense of wonder and creativity. He recognized the style immediately. "These are hers," Jake whispered, his hands trembling as he turned the pages. "My mom's." Henry nodded, his eyes glistening. "She always said art was her way of making sense of the world. I thought, maybe it could help you feel closer to her." Jake's throat tightened as he traced the lines of a sketch, a self-portrait of Clara with a note scrawled in the corner. "Dream big, always." For the first time in years, Jake felt a connection to his mother that wasn't rooted in loss, but in love. Inspired by the sketchbook, Jake threw himself into his art with renewed passion. He began a series of paintings based on his mother's sketches, blending her vision with his own. The series, titled Dream Big, quickly gained attention in the art community, with critics praising its raw emotion and storytelling. At the opening of the Dream Big exhibit, the gallery was packed with visitors. Henry stood proudly by Jake's side, introducing him to collectors and artists. Emma beamed from across the room, her heart swelling with pride for the boy she had once found shivering outside the diner. "You've come so far," she said when they found a quiet moment together. "I hope you see that." Jake smiled, his gaze sweeping over the room. "It doesn't feel real sometimes, but I'm starting to believe it's okay to let myself feel proud." The exhibit's success brought new opportunities for Jake, including offers to collaborate with other artists and showcase his work internationally. But beyond the professional accolades, the most profound change was the sense of belonging he had found, with Emma, with Henry, and with the memory of his mother. As the months turned into a year, Jake and Henry worked together on a new project, a community art program aimed at supporting underprivileged youth. They established workshops, providing supplies and mentorship to kids who, like Jake, had faced hardship and felt unseen. "It's not just about the art," Jake said during one of the program sessions. It's about giving these kids a chance to see their worth, to know they're capable of more than just surviving. Henry watched with pride as Jake guided the kids, his passion and empathy shining through. "Your mother would be so proud," he said quietly. One evening, as Jake and Emma walked through the park where they had first met, Jake paused by the bench where he had once sat, cold and hungry. He ran a hand over the worn wood, memories flooding back. "This place feels different now," he said. "It used to remind me of everything I didn't have. Now it reminds me of how far I've come." Emma smiled, linking her arm through his. "You've built something incredible, Jake. For yourself, for others. You should be proud." Jake nodded, his heart full. "I am, and I'm grateful. For you, for Henry, for everything that's brought me here." As the city lights twinkled around them, Jake felt a sense of peace he had never known. His journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but he knew he wasn't facing them alone. With the support of those who believed in him, and the strength he had discovered within himself, Jake was ready for whatever came next. For the boy who had once been invisible, the world was now full of possibility, a canvas waiting to be painted with the vibrant colors of hope, resilience, and love. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.